Good morning and welcome to Rising. So just like past incidents similar to the Uvalde, Texas elementary school massacre, there have been, in this case as well, new updates and revisions to the facts. So we'd like to tell you what's come to light so far since last we addressed this issue. Yesterday, Texas officials said all victims had been identified and their families notified. One 10-year-old girl is in serious condition and two others are in good condition. The shooter's grandmother is reportedly in serious condition after being shot in the head.
Texas Director of Public Safety also confirmed that there was indeed a police officer on campus at Robby Elementary who exchanged gunfire with Salvador Ramos. That is when the shooter ran inside the school, barricaded himself in a class, and began firing. While the tragedy has sparked a raw renewal over gun reform, questions of police competence have also arisen after more facts have come to light. NBC News correspondent Tom Winter tweeted, quote, "For the second time, it appears the information initially provided by Texas law enforcement officials was wrong. The shooter was not stopped by the first officer that encountered him. He wasn't pinned down, but rather appears to have locked himself in a classroom."
According to AP News, the shooter went in a classroom and locked the door. Police on scene actually left him there. When Border Patrol showed up, they couldn't break down the door, and after about 40 minutes to an hour, they got a member of the school staff to unlock it with a key. Senior reporter at Vice News, Tess Owen, wrote about the discrepancies in the timeline given by officials, and she joins us now to discuss the timeline further. Welcome, Tess, to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Tess, we saw some shocking images and accounts of parents being stopped by the police, from being kept from saving their own children, going as far as pinning some parents to the ground. The AP reports that parents and onlookers at the scene urged police to actually do something and breach the building during that full 40-minute killing spree. But according to the report, officers didn't go in. We have a pretty long clip of the timeline given by Congressman Gonzalez to Jake Tapper. Let's watch that and get your reaction on the other side.
Pinned down. So I have two questions about this, and maybe you can clear this up. How was the gunman able to get into the school if the resource officer had engaged with him but no gunfire was exchanged? How did he get in?
Yeah, so it started at his home. You know, he tragically shoots his grandmother, and then he gets in a vehicle and he drives to the school. It's less than a mile away, so it's really right around the corner. And as he comes to the school, he wrecks. He kind of goes into this ditch, and it's when he got into that ditch is when law enforcement was called and engaged. You know, so that's part of the initial contact. It was no firing that I understand. He actually enters through the back of one of the buildings, through the teacher parking lot, if you will. He immediately enters one room, and then essentially that's when the police, the law enforcement officer, because it's not just police officers, it's sheriffs, it's Border Patrol agents. I mean, everybody came together. People are not even in this county, and they basically cornered him into one room. There are hundreds of children in that school. Part of the story, there's a lieutenant named Javier Martinez, engages this assailant. He takes fire. He actually was wounded. You know, it's tragic to see so many children be murdered, but this could have been a whole lot worse. People like Javier Martinez and Chief Arredondo, they saved hundreds of lives. So that's where you see him get pinned in.
Well, he was pinned, but just to be clear, he's pinned down or pinned in a classroom where he was slaughtering kids, right? I mean, is that what you mean by pinned down?
I understand that he went in that classroom and he begins to fire. He begins to murder people, starting with that wonderful teacher that was defending her students, and he doesn't stop. The police officer actually engages him. Javier Martinez engages him. He kind of takes fire through the door, and then it stops, and he barricades himself in. That's where there's kind of a lull in the action. All of it, I understand, lasted about an hour, but this is where there's kind of a 30-minute lull. They feel as if they got him barricaded in. The rest of the students in the school are now leaving. You know, they're trying to get people out to safety, and this assailant is barricaded in. It's moments later or minutes later when they breach it, and then ultimately a Border Patrol agent is the one that neutralizes this assailant.
All right. It still seems like a lot of time that the police were outside the classroom and the shooter was inside the classroom where there were kids.
Okay, Tess, there's a lot there that people are going to be frustrated by. What does it mean to engage someone? It seems like a careful avoidance of the word, shot at. We've discovered that the person was not wearing the protective gear that he was initially represented as having worn. How do we end up here? And can you unpack a little bit how the information has been trickling out and why there was so much misunderstanding yesterday?
So the timeline is all over the place, and they cannot seem to get their story straight of what happened. I started out yesterday trying to just sort of build a simple timeline of, the facts of the time that he arrived at school, the time that he in quote engaged with a particular officer. The version of events that I had understood it yesterday following the press conference was that 11:20. He texted the girl that morning saying that he was going to kill his grandmother. 11:20, he texts that girl saying that he had shot his grandmother in the head and that he was going to shoot up an elementary school. His grandmother reportedly called 911, but I'm not sure when that was. He got in his truck, drove a short distance to the school, turned into a ditch that was sort of adjacent to school property. I looked at it on Google Earth. It's about sort of a width of a football field, maybe 100 yards away from school buildings. Someone called 911 to report the crash, and then this is where it gets fuzzy. DPS Director Steve McCraw said yesterday at the press conference held by Texas officials that there was a school resource officer who had learned about the 911 reports and saw him and attempted to confront him and maybe had engaged him, but that was very unclear. The gunman went inside anyway, and from what I understood, then a few more officers then showed up, and that there was some exchange of gunfire, and numerous people with DPS had said that those officers sustained injuries. And then this gets to the bit where the shooter ends up in the classroom. Governor Greg Abbott had described the classroom as one that was internally connected to another classroom. So some DPS spokespersons had said that he had barricaded himself in there. McCraw used language which gave me pause, which was that he said twice that the police have been responsible for containing the shooter in a classroom. So my question after seeing that was, was the classroom empty? Were there children in the classroom that he was contained into? And how long was he in that classroom? Mm-hmm. And that's what we're starting to learn a bit more. We know from AP's reporting, for example, that police have set up a perimeter around the school and that there were these, anguished scenes of parents who wanted to go in there and feeling like the police weren't doing enough. And the Texas officials have been very opaque with the timeline, with how long. I think they said, 40 to an hour that it went on for.
Right, and at no point has anyone suggested that the classroom he was pinned in was empty, and we know the victims were all from the same classroom, so that suggests that in fact he was pinned there with the victims. So the idea that it would take so long to get the door open, like as people are being murdered in real time, it is what it is, but the way it's being spun immediately as some triumph of law enforcement coordination and resources, like by that guest Jake Tapper was interviewing, when no, at the least it looks like that was not a great thing to have him trapped or whatever in that classroom. That's where the people were being killed. Obviously, and then we're starting to see footage of people outside wanting to go in and help the police, and maybe it's not a good idea for them to do that, but the police, instead of trying to get this door open, trying to track down an employee. How could that take an hour to track down an employee who can open this door when they're putting more effort into keeping people from intervening? I think that's going to very reasonably make people quite upset to learn if that was the case. That's what was going on.
I also think, just the timeline. I've covered a lot of mass shootings, unfortunately, in the last few years, and school shootings in particular as well. And, there's details are always a little fuzzy. Narratives can shift, but one thing that often is quite consistent is time. They can say pretty clearly when the shooting started, when it stopped, when police arrived on scene, when a shooter was taken into custody or killed. Those are details that are usually pretty stable. And so the fact that we're not really getting a clear time that, they're saying, the shooter arrived in the school and then a tactical unit arrived and killed the shooter. But what they're not saying is that an hour passed in that time frame, and they're not saying what happened in that hour. So I think that's going to be something that is going to be heavily scrutinized, I hope, in the days and weeks to come.
Right.
Yeah,
yeah, and they initially said he was wearing body armor. I think we even read that detail off yesterday on the show, and that, from what I understand now, is not actually the case. He was wearing sort of gear that allows you to carry extra ammo, but is not protective from being shot.
That's right. I mean, I think that could have been somebody might who placed that 911 call might have made a mistake or misspoke. So that's one detail which I guess I'm sort of slightly more not sympathetic to, but I understand how that could have been misconstrued. But I do think that just the shifting timeline has really been giving me pause. And I think also the fact that Governor Greg Abbott so far, the narrative that he has been sort of pushing is that this could have been so much worse. I think he actually said yesterday, he gave a sort of bizarre, I found it slightly bizarre, glass half full, which is that, this was horrible, but his words were, it could have been worse. And I think this is going to be what we see from these Texas officials trying to justify their actions, because they're going to say more children, more teachers would have been killed had they not done what they did.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of folks who would accept some of the mistakes in terms of how the information trickled out as honest mistakes made in good faith, but for what seems to be an affirmative push to characterize everything in a really sunny, sanguine light that seems out of touch with what has happened, no matter where fault and blame lies. And so that's why you start to have people asking, is there a rumor that there's body armor worn as a way to exculpate police officers for perhaps not shooting the person, since there were apparently all of these different kinds of law enforcement officers on the scene who had, quote, engaged him before going into the room. How was the door ultimately opened? I'm not sure if we know that. If it took 40 minutes to an hour to figure out how to break down a door. There have been images of, SWAT teams and all of these, what seem to be almost excessive resources for such a small town there. And it seems kind of incredulous that if you have a SWAT team in the vicinity, it would take so long just to break down a door at an elementary school, much less find a key to open it. I mean, I think that cluster of things is why people are so skeptical. Do we know anything
How
about
long does
the door?
it take for the cops to open a door in a no-knock raid? 5
Exactly.
seconds?
Right.
Very true. And I think all of this, I mean, in terms of the messaging coming from Texas officials, is that, a lot of sort of gun rights activists and frankly Republicans will often push the line in the wake of mass shootings that, the good guy with a gun myth, that, had there been a good Samaritan with a gun in the vicinity of a shooting, that, tragedy could have been averted, lives could have been saved. In this case, we had multiple officers, law enforcement officers with guns who were on the scene, and they failed to prevent one person, one 18-year-old, from killing 19 children and 2 adults.
Yeah. I think part of my skepticism of the early sort of law enforcement did everything right and it could have been so much worse narrative, because I remember Parkland, the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting, where it turned out that actually the school resource officer he cowered as the shooting was going on. He had been trained by the sheriff department, a horrifically corrupt department that gave bad training and bad guidance, and also knew about this. That kid, Nicholas Cruz, had been reported to law enforcement. He'd been reported to the FBI. It was the see something, say something mentality. People saw something and said something. The police just obviously did not take the right steps. In this case, do we know yet? I've been trying to find this out and not totally coming up with the right with the answers, but maybe something happened overnight. Do we know the extent to which he was known to law enforcement? I've previous to the shooting, I've seen some indication that maybe there were cops at his house when he moved from his parents to his grandmother's house. Anything like that?
That's something that I'm still trying to look into as well, and us at Vice News have been looking into. We cover one of the main subject areas we cover at Vice News is extremism, and so we've been looking to see what, in terms of motivation, whether there was any nexus there or whether he was perhaps inspired by previous school shooters. There's a whole online culture where that's a thing, for example. And so I think, I'm not sure exactly about the degree to which he was known by law enforcement, but certainly he had a habit of posting troubling things on various social media accounts. He was posting guns on his Instagram, and he was messaging this girl that he'd met on an app called Yubo. But as far as kind of what police, what law enforcement did or didn't know, or whether there were any whether he'd been reported to the FBI or anything like that, we still don't really know that.
You mentioned that there was a call by the grandmother, a 911 call. What do we know about that, the content of the call, or what, if anything, the response was from law enforcement?
That was something that I learned yesterday afternoon. I was trying to piece together again the timeline, and when those first calls came in, it's not entirely clear. Initially, they said that the first calls came in at 11:20 a.m., reporting that he'd crashed his car into a ditch. But then I think it was the Washington Post who reported on these messages that he had exchanged with this young woman in Germany, where he had just said that where he'd written to her at 11:20, I just shot my grandmother and I'm going to go shoot up an elementary school. So there's a little bit of a timeline discrepancy. It's possible that maybe the 11:20 calls came from the grandmother. Again, these are more sort of just fuzzy details. But what is clear, I think, that he was in the school vicinity, or in the area of Robb Elementary School, I'd say 11:30 at 11:45 a.m. And then what we do know is that the shooter was taken or they said taken into custody. He was killed by 1 p.m.
Yeah, and Abbott said something about that he posted on Facebook that he killed his grandmother, was going to do a school shooting. But then I later understood, or at least Facebook has claimed, that those were private messages, so not the kind of thing that they're routinely screening, which I think most people, most of us civil libertarians don't want Facebook routinely reading all our DMs just in case there's something like this. But does that explanation, is that satisfactory?
Yeah, I think it seemed to have happened also. He made those messages within an hour period. It seems like in that morning. I'm not sure what his longer history was like posting on Facebook, whether he actually posted more alarming content on his public, if there was a public facing aspect to it. Again, these are all sort of details that I think that we're probably going to find out down the road.
Well, Tess, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yep. And we'll have more Rising right after this.